things get a little haywire and a little confusing. And next thing you know, we have additional addendums and rules that continue to flourish throughout over the past years. So what the prime law does is it breaks everything down back to the simplest form. You know, our main objective, our main purpose of life is to prosper and live happily. That's it. And as having a government, the government is really to provide those conditions that allows us to fulfill that purpose of living happily and to prosper. Unfortunately, too many things have happened over the past years with man really wanting to have more control and more authority and rulings so that they can become just like kings over our land. So that needs to be removed. So removing the law of man really places the responsibility back into our own hands so that we can have the life that we were meant to live.
You know, it's fascinating. When I listen to what you said, I hear, different words and different phrases that are very important. It's to provide the conditions. That's a very powerful statement. Provide the conditions for us to live prosperously and happily. Provide the conditions, not rule over us.
Right.
There's a big difference there,
That's
right?
King.
The king, the king. And I think in our country today, people don't realize what has happened. And Michael Dewar, I'd like to ask you a point, because I know you really understand this area also, is our founding fathers, they really had a very proactive approach to really look towards what the prime law was. Could you have comments about that? Mark addresses our founding fathers and the way the Constitution was written originally, but obviously went off a bit. And I think that's something where maybe, because people will say, well, we had the founding fathers. We were a democratic country. We're free. We're able to do things. But what are they missing when we realize where the founding fathers went and where we're a bit off track on that?
Well, Steve, my theory about it is that when the founding fathers founded the country and wrote the Constitution, they had this ideal that was everybody's ideal. Everybody agreed. They all had the same concepts. And it all goes back to the reason that they started the revolution, and that was because the unfair rule of man with the king of England, everybody understood that wasn't right and it didn't work. Everybody understood that back then. So it was implicit. It was widely known. Everybody knew that the rule of man was corruptible and didn't work. And at that time, it wasn't even conceivable to those people that the rule of man would creep back in, because the whole reason for the revolution was because of the rule of man. So it's really unfortunate that we forgot why we had the revolution. The United States became independent. If we would just remember why and really interpret that Constitution the way it was intended, we would be living in the 12 Visions world right now. Everybody would be rich, even the poor.
When we return, we'll hear more from the national officers of the 12 Visions Party with your host, Steve Fagan. You're listening to NTR, Neothink Radio, on the road to the White House with the 12 Visions Party. Visit neothinkradio.com. NTR. Neothink Radio Network. NTR, Neothink Radio Network, on the road to the White House with the 12 Visions Party. The 12 Visions Party, the TVP, is not a tea party and is not affiliated with any political party. It is made up of market businessmen and women, not career politicians. The TVP president will introduce the Prime Law of Protection, which will be an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. It is then that real change will come. What are the 12 visions of the 12 Visions Party? What is the prime law of a protection-only government? These answers coming up. NTR Neothink Radio, on the road to the White House, with your host, Steve Fagan. Now let's get right back to the conversation with your host, Steve Fagan, and the national officers of the 12 Visions Party.
Now, this is a very important area, gentlemen. Is there anybody else who'd like to elaborate a little bit more on that area before we move on?
Yeah, Steve, if I may.
Yeah, hi, Tom. Tom Carey. Good evening.
Hi. Everybody thinks that the men who sat down and figured out the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and everything were all lawyers. They weren't. There were writers. Some of them were farmers. Some of them were shoemakers. These were just ordinary, everyday people in extraordinary circumstances who made the decision that the rule of man should end and it should change. The other thing is a quote that I've heard of Ben Franklin when asked about democracy, was very clear and said, it'll do until something better comes along. And we know that something better is the prime law, the rule of law itself, pure law,
right,
that will control man and let the law rule rather than, man doing this. I mean, we've had 200 years to learn how to do it, and man still can't do it. Not without causing hardship and heartbreak and wars and everything else. So it's time to make that big change, that final change, and take the ruling class out of the equation, put the prime law into the place that it needs to be, create the government as the protection-only government the way they intended it. I mean, that's what it was for. They set up the government of the United States to protect them against people like the king.
Very, very good information, Tom, because you're right. It's very important to realize that it's rule, the king. What we're saying here is listening to what we're talking about. We're hearing rule, king. Remember, go back to your history. Who was the ruling class, and where do you compare that to? Look at, because in our country we hear the word democracy. We're a democratic country. Everything is fine. But look at right now where our country's at, and let me just throw some words out here, and then we can elaborate on it, team, is debt, massive regulations, increase of taxes. This is happening with the rule of man here in this country. I mean, when does it stop? And this is just a few areas that kind of really put food for thought out there. Was this what our forefathers were looking to have us do? It doesn't sound like it. And we have to make some changes. So with that in mind, Lauren, let me ask you something, if you don't mind. I'd like to ask a little bit about self-serving laws. Mark brings that up versus natural laws. Do you have any comments about that you'd like to address? And, what that self-serving approach?
I'm glad you asked, because I was thinking about what Carlton alluded to earlier about the prime law based on universal principles. And I'm thinking about what Mark said about the rule of law. Is kind of confusing because often people get the rule of man confused with the rule of law and vice versa. So I think it's important to understand that what is meant by the rule of law is actually ruled by these universal principles. And one of those, of course, is protection only. And once people understand that, it becomes much easier. It's kind of like the golden rule is based on kind of a natural law, a basic principle. And, it's, again, reducing things to those simplest things that are so important.
It's a very good point. And you bring up a very good subject, protection only. Our audience is probably going to say, well, exactly what does that mean? What does that encumber? Does anybody want to step in there a little bit and kind of clarify what protection only is? Because we are obviously, that's what we're looking to do.
Well, basically, all the focus of at least the federal government is only about protection. How do they protect the 50 states? Because that's the way it was originally intended. We would elect a president. He was a president of the 50 states, not of the people. He was not a president of the people. Yeah, he's elected by the people, but he's not a president of the people. And the idea was that the government needed to be large enough to protect those 50 states as a group, but not small enough that they basically micromanaged everything. Remember, the states were supposed to be mini laboratories. The states were supposed to work out all these different ideas and come